Okay. Excuse me. So, I'm Brian Tokar, and I've been involved with the Institute since the 1980s, written a number of books on a variety of ecological topics. My most recent one, Toward Climate Justice, is available out at the tables. It's distributed in the US by AK Press, published by a collective of social ecologists in Norway. And I also am a lecturer at University of Vermont in environmental studies, and have been writing and organizing and thinking about these questions for a long time. I guess another thing I want to emphasize at the outset is if the small taste of these ideas that you're getting here today draws you to wanting to find out more about it, there are flyers on the table. We have a number of things going on this summer. We have a week-long intensive course that's happening in the Upper Hudson Valley. We have our annual gathering up in Vermont. We also now have an online course in social ecology that is just wrapping up its first cycle. And if you check out our website, you can sign up and find out more about that. It's an 8-week lecture series, and there are also discussions that go with that. And we've had participants from literally every corner of the world in the first 40 people that participated in that class. So if you're interested in finding out more, there are many ways to do that, as well as a fairly extensive literature in social ecology, 20 or 25 books of Murray Bookchin's and others by Dan and myself and Chaya Heller, who was originally scheduled to be here today and isn't able. For 50 years, social ecologists have been intensely engaged in a project of aiming to radicalize environmental and other movements and to bring a broad ecological perspective to the left. And when this project began in the mid-1960s, there was nothing that would even remotely be described as an environmental or ecological movement. Murray Bookchin's focus on ecological issues and centering organizing in communities really emerged out of his understanding of the total co-optation of the labor movement in the aftermath of World War II. The idea, which was fairly shocking to people at the time, that capitalism could indeed readily accommodate depression and war, but maybe the emerging ecological crisis was finally something that was going to be beyond the capacity of capitalism to cope with. Now, 50 years later, we have this phenomenon of green capitalism, which many of us have been in the forefront of challenging, but there are inherent limitations to the ability of capitalism, which of course inherently depends on its ability to continue to grow and expand, to function in an environment of ecological constraint. Back in the late 1950s, there were beginning to be a number of environmental think tanks that were focused primarily on challenges of resource management in a period of rapidly expanding consumption in the global north. But many ecological scientists, even 55 years ago, were questioning the growth imperative of capitalism, at least in an implicit way, where there was a discussion that maybe there was something inherently subversive about ecology as a science. Coming out of those discussions, in 1965, Murray Bookchin wrote a crucially important pamphlet called Ecology and Revolutionary Thought, where he took the discussion to the next step. Let me just read you a short paragraph. He wrote, and remember, we're talking 1965, the explosive implications of an ecological approach arise not only because ecology is intrinsically a critical science, critical on a scale that the most radical systems of political economy have failed to attain. Strong implicit critique there. but also because it is an integrative and reconstructive science. And this integrative, reconstructive aspect of ecology, carried through to its implications, lead directly into anarchic areas of social thought. It's impossible to achieve harmonization of humans and nature without creating a human community that lives in a lasting balance with its natural environment. Something that not very many people were thinking about in the mid-1960s. Of course, these ideas very quickly began to have an influence in the emerging ecological movements of the late 60s. For many of us at the Institute, though, the first explicit expression of social ecology in a movement was in the movement against nuclear power that several of us in this room were involved in the late 1970s. There was a regional network in the Northeast, particularly in New England, called the Clamshell Alliance, that was committed to both direct action and direct democracy. It was really the first political formation to adopt the now familiar model of affinity groups and spokes councils as its underlying structure. Bear in mind that for many of the founders of that movement, these were initially very instrumental techniques that were aimed to facilitate organizing, but those of us who were informed by social ecology were able to bring in the understanding of the fundamental roots of these organizational principles in the Spanish anarchist movement of the mid-20th century and other like-minded movements before it. The other thing that was explicitly prefigurative in the anti-nuclear movement that the Institute for Social Ecology in its early years played a central role in was the emerging long-range view of a decentralized solar economy in explicit conflict with the image of a nuclear state. And at its best, that movement really reflected the kind of dialectical understanding of the link between oppositional movements and the reconstructive building alternative dimension of movements that's been a crucially important part of so many movements since then. The Institute was involved early on in developing the merging of ecology and feminism. Social ecologists like Yanestra King, who's here at the Left Forum this weekend and might stop in during this session. She had a session in the first time slot just before this with some other folks, shaping a dialectical understanding of how women's consciousness is in many ways a product of long history of oppression of women, and also the historical association of women with nature. And Nesta and others aim to draw out the liberatory potential of that connection, not falling into the kinds of romanticisms and essentialisms that one wing of ecofeminism embraced, but really advancing a liberatory third way, also furthered in Chaya Heller's work on the politics of desire. In the 1980s, many of us became involved in early debates around green politics in the United States, long before there were discussions about green parties and running for national office. We really pushed the early Greens in the US in the direction of being a network of grassroots activists, creating an ecologically centered movement from below that, inspired by the early German Greens, saw itself as having a foot in the world of electoral politics at the local level, but primarily being a network of core activists in many different movements. Of course, this vision for the Greens was severely undermined, in our view, by Ralph Nader's first two campaigns for president. There was clearly a lot of potential in terms of raising issues and raising a broader analysis in those campaigns, just as there is in Bernie Sanders' current campaign for president. But the central flaw of those efforts was that they seriously undermined that more holistic, more decentralized vision for the Greens as a movement of movements. And now we have a very different kind of party-centered Green organization, which again has a lot to offer. I voted for Jill Stein 4 years ago and intend to again, but it's not the kind of vision that was articulated early on. And these were the years during which Murray Bookchin began to map out his program of libertarian municipalism, system of confederal, directly democratic structures organized at the community level, really rooted in a long-range strategy of revolutionary dual power. And in contrast to the push toward increasing bureaucratization of what's now, or what became in the late 90s and early 2000s, the U.S. Green Party, we helped develop a left-green network, a youth Greens organization. One of the important accomplishments of those two formations was in 1990, around the celebrations of the 20th anniversary of Earth Day, we called for the Earth Day Wall Street action, which maybe some of you remember. It was the first post-60s action to explicitly call to shut down Wall Street, and in one of Juan Gonzalez's early columns that became widely distributed, he really reported on that as an important alternative to the increasingly corporate-dominated Earth Day festivals that were happening in Central Park and other places. As Dan mentioned, from the mid-90s through the early 2000s, many of us were very focused on the issue of genetic engineering of food. In those early years of the anti-GMO movement, we tried to bring a much more holistic and ethical approach to that issue, really trying to move away from the kind of narrow consumerism that we see as being behind many of the current efforts. We had an explicit analysis of genetic engineering as a form of commodification, and as Dan mentioned, used our Vermont town meetings and then eventually town meetings around New England to pass resolutions against genetic engineering, to pressure state governments to take various small steps, but also helped inspire efforts on the West Coast, where a number of California counties that have more political clout to actually legislate policy than our towns in Vermont do. Several California counties explicitly banned the raising of GMOs. And there were some political questions that arose during that process that helped us understand both the political potential of that kind of town meeting organizing and also some of its limitations. We learned that towns in Vermont, as well as cities and towns in all but 11 US states, are governed by an obscure 1868 Iowa Supreme Court decision known as Dillon's Rule, that basically says that towns and cities are legally a creation of the states. And therefore, in order for towns to legislate, even in Vermont, with our hundreds of years of uninterrupted town meeting engagement, if a city or town, including the city of Burlington, by the way, wants to pass an ordinance and enforce it, they literally have to then go to the state capitol and get permission from the state legislature. So as an organizing vehicle, town meetings are powerful. As an ethical statement of the will of the people, town meetings are powerful. But politically, we're still quite constrained in terms of what we can do. Social ecologists were very active in Seattle around the shutdown of the World Trade Organization in 1999. A number of people from the ISE, including one of our current staff people who is from Seattle, were involved in the effort to broaden the discussions of democratization of the movement and of society more broadly, and an explicitly anti-hierarchical orientation into that movement. There was an effort to sustain the direct action network that came out of the WTO shutdown as a national network. There's a pamphlet that came out in preparation for the April 2000 action at the World Bank and IMF called Bringing Democracy Home that we released, that you can download from our website. Continuing influence on many European movements, especially urban-focused movements aimed at empowering neighborhoods and democratizing cities. Occupy Wall Street, again, many people intimately involved in both on the ground, in the park, a lot of revolutionary education around that. We did 2 week-long intensives here in New York in early 2012 that had very large participation, and people from the ISE were also very involved in the ongoing discussion of what's the appropriate relationship between open assemblies and more ground-up spokes models of decision-making within Occupy. The prefigurative dimensions of Occupy were heavily criticized in some left circles, but were very much at the core of that movement's appeal, and many of us at the ISE have been involved in continuing to advance that kind of thinking. For about the last 10 years, many of us have also been involved in the evolving movements for climate justice. We supported the first climate justice network in the US called the Mobilization for Climate Justice, another network that was at the center of environmental opposition to carbon markets. We've embraced the approach put forward by environmental justice activists, featuring the demands and politics of those on the front lines of the environmental crisis, but also have tried to bring in the dimension that comes from more from European climate justice activists, and also the International Rising Tide Network, that is the explicitly anti-capitalist dimension of the climate movement, as well as the broadly reconstructive and utopian dimension. The idea that we can all live better at lower levels of consumption by northern standards, and that we need radical changes in the energy system, the economic system, and the political system simultaneously, and a lot of hands-on experiments that go with that. And I guess I'll just end by saying that that there's a lot of critical discussions of various movements that continue to happen at the ISE, but what Murray Bookchin urged us to do, especially in his later years, which led to his split with many people who continued to primarily work in the anarchist tradition, was the focus on organizing, on strategy, and on institution building, really looking toward the long-range goal of building a movement that can aspire to a genuine sense of revolutionary dual power and moving forward toward broader transformations from there. Thanks.